A
This is
teenage
private
boy
property.
stands on a
You are
diving
all
board,
trespassing and
arms
in
spread
direct
wide,
violation
the
of
summer sun
explicit
blazing
HOA
behind him.
bylaws. I'm calling your
His
parents and the
friends cheer
police.
from the pool deck. A woman's silhouette appears at the fence line, her face obscured. The boy looks down, confused. The woman steps forward into harsh sunlight, revealing an official HOA badge clipped to her belt. Her expression shifts from polite to stone cold, the summer heat wrapped around the Valencia estate subdivision like a shroud, turning perfectly manicured lawns into versions of themselves that only survived through religious attention. It was June 15th, and Marcus Chen had just been elected HOA president with 61% of the vote, a landslide born from 2 years of watching the neighborhood decay under incompetent leadership. Marcus stood in her kitchen that morning, coffee in hand, looking out over the community from her second-floor window. She'd moved to Valencia Estates 5 years ago specifically for its reputation, quiet, well-maintained, a place where property values climbed steadily year after year. That reputation had started crumbling 12 months ago when the previous HOA president, Gerald Finch, essentially disappeared into early retirement, leaving behind a 300-property community with no enforcement, no direction, and no one willing to step up. Marcus had been a compliance officer for a mid-sized corporation for 18 years. She understood rules, enforcement, and the delicate psychology of making people follow them. She'd campaigned on a platform of restoration and accountability, printed leaflets with before and after photos of homes that had fallen into disrepair, and promised a return to the Valencia estates that residents had moved into. The community voted overwhelmingly in her favor. Her first act was calling an emergency meeting to approve the new enforcement budget. Her second was hiring a compliance consultant. Her third was creating a digital violation tracking system that would eventually hold every property owner accountable for every infraction, no matter how small. This was the week before she discovered that enforcing rules was far easier than enforcing them against people who were used to 3 years of impunity. The first violation notices went out on Monday. 73 of them. By Wednesday, she'd received 47 angry emails and been accosted twice at the community center. By Friday, there were 2 anonymous letters in her mailbox, one printed on corporate letterhead from someone who worked in legal, another handwritten in childish script that made her jaw clench. She'd expected resistance. She hadn't expected it to be quite so personal. The property at 447 Elm Street belonged to Karen Hutchins, whose son Tyler was currently a senior at Peninsula High School and who had, according to the violation report Marcus pulled up during her morning review, let his mother's pool go into complete disrepair approximately 8 months ago. The algae situation had evolved from green to brown to something that looked less like water and more like a science experiment. Karen had received 3 violation notices and responded to none of them. Marcus had made the decision to personally handle this one. She wanted to understand the psychology of it, why someone would pay HOA fees and then willfully ignore infractions. She wanted to see if a personal touch might accomplish what automated notices could not. She dressed for the heat, white linen pants, a cream-colored button-down, her HOA president badge clipped to her belt like a sidearm. She looked professional. She looked serious. She looked like someone who was not going to take any shit. The walk to 447 Elm Street took 7 minutes. The house itself was a disappointment, a beige ranch-style home with white shutters that had faded to a mottled cream. The front lawn was half brown, half green, with brown patches forming a disturbing pattern that suggested someone had given up on watering at strategic intervals. The pool, visible from the street over the side fence, was exactly as bad as the photographs in the system. Marcus was raising her hand to knock on the front door when she heard it, a chorus of teenage voices, the shriek of a cannonball, the sounds of summer joy amplified to stadium levels. She walked around the side of the house instead. The pool deck had been transformed into something resembling a resort. 8 teenagers, maybe 9, were scattered across various states of summer leisure. 2 girls in bikinis reclined on lounge chairs with their phones, barely glancing at the activity. 3 boys were in the water, engaged in what looked like an elaborate game involving a beach ball. A girl in a tank top was attempting to set up a portable Bluetooth speaker, wrestling with a tangled charging cable. And standing on the diving board, arms spread like a crucified prophet, was a teenager who could only be Tyler Hutchins. He was tall, lean in that way that comes from youth rather than actual fitness, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and the kind of easy confidence that only existed in people who'd never truly faced consequences. He was grinning, absolutely grinning, about to jump into a pool that was in direct violation of 3 municipal codes. Marcus didn't shout. She walked to the fence, unlatched the gate, which had been left open, and stepped through into the pool deck area. She moved like she was walking through her own yard, which, technically, she wasn't, but which bore the weight of official authority. The atmosphere changed immediately. It was like someone had unplugged the summer. The music died mid-song. The girl setting up the speaker froze. The teenagers in the water stopped moving. Tyler was still on the diving board, but his grin had faltered. His arms came down slightly. "I need everyone out of the pool," Marcus said. Her voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone stating facts that were beyond negotiation. "Now, please." "Who are you?" One of the boys in the water, heavy-set, sunburned, spoke first. He had the tone of someone used to being told what to do. Marcus walked to the pool's edge, hands folded in front of her, and for the first time, really looked at the water. It was worse than the photograph suggested. There was actual debris, a beer can floated near the deep end, along with what appeared to be a phone case. The water itself had taken on a milky quality that suggested bacterial growth had reached what they probably considered ambient levels. "I'm Marcus Chin," she said, her eyes finding Tyler's. "The new HOA president. And this pool is in violation of 17 different codes. The fact that it's also now being used by multiple people who are not members of the household means we're looking at a liability issue that's frankly making my head hurt." "This is Karen's son," one of the girls offered, pointing at Tyler. She was trying to be helpful, the way people were when they sensed genuine adult authority. "Like, he lives here." "I'm aware," Marcus said. "And I'm also aware that his mother has been notified 3 times about the pool's condition. So I'm going to need Tyler to get out of that pool, I'm going to need everyone else to get dressed and go home, and I'm going to need to speak with his mother about what happens next." Tyler finally jumped down from the diving board. He didn't climb the ladder with any sense of urgency, though. He was playing it cool, all teenage swagger, his dripping body making dark marks on the pool deck. "My mom's not home," he said, and there was an edge of defiance in it, the kind of defiance that only works when you're half naked and obviously in violation of something. "She's at work. You want to talk to her? You can call her." "What's your mother's name?" Marcus asked, though she already knew. "Karen Hutchins." "And you are?" "Tyler Hutchins." "Well, Tyler," Marcus said, pulling her phone from her pocket, "I'm going to give you an opportunity to contact your mother before I do. You have 10 minutes to get everyone out of the pool and off this property. If I have to call her myself, I'll be filing an additional violation for unsupervised gathering of minors in a hazardous conditions area, which carries a $300 fine and a requirement for the property to be posted with 'No Trespassing' signage. Is that clear?" Tyler's swagger flickered. The other teenagers were already moving, though, scrambling for their belongings, suddenly very aware that this was no longer the fun pool party but rather a situation with actual stakes. "That's kind of harsh," Tyler said, but he was backing away from the pool, water streaming down his lean teenage frame. "What's harsh," Marcus said, "is your mother ignoring 3 violation notices and continuing to expose your family to liability. So I suggest you use your 10 minutes productively." She turned away from him, facing the pool instead, and pulled up her phone. She didn't dial. She just held it there, thumb hovering over the screen, a perfect portrait of someone waiting to escalate the situation. It was a bluff, but it was a very well-executed bluff. Behind her, there was a flurry of activity. Teenagers gathering towels. The Bluetooth speaker being turned off mid-song. Whispered conversations that she was pretty sure involved varying degrees of profanity. Within 5 minutes, the pool deck had been cleared. Within 7, Tyler emerged from inside the house with his phone pressed to his ear, his face a mixture of anger and something that might have been genuine concern. "Mom," he was saying, "there's someone here from the HOA." And she said, yeah, I know, yeah, okay, I'll tell her." He held the phone away from his ear and looked at Marcus with the expression of someone who just realized that his summer had taken a turn. "She wants to know what her options are," he said. Marcus took the phone from him. She could feel his surprise at the gesture, that she'd just take his mother's phone call, that she'd crossed that threshold from confrontation to direct negotiation. "Karen," Marcus said. "This is Marcus Chen, the new HOA president. I'm calling about the pool at 447 Elm Street." Karen's voice came through the speaker loud enough that Tyler could hear it. She sounded harried, the particular stress of someone calling from work. "I know about the pool," Karen said. "I've been meaning to get someone out to fix it. It's just been a crazy summer, Ann." "It's been a crazy 3 years," Marcus interrupted, not unkindly, but with the firmness of someone who was done with excuses. "You've had 3 violation notices. The pool is in violation of Municipal Code 12.4.5 regarding standing water on residential properties, and there are now minors swimming in that water, which opens you up to liability issues that your homeowner's insurance may not even cover." "I understand, but what I need from you," Marcus continued, "is a written plan by Monday with a specific timeline for remediation. Either the pool is drained and the algae is cleaned by July 15th, or I'll have to move forward with an escalated enforcement procedure, which includes additional fines. Do you understand?" There was a pause. Marcus could hear the sound of Karen's office in the background, keyboards, the murmur of other people's conversations, the ambient stress of a workplace. "Yes," Karen said finally, and in that single word, Marcus could hear the shift from defiance to capitulation. "I understand." "Good. I'll expect your plan by Monday. You can email it to me directly, or you can print it out and drop it in my mailbox. 447, Elm Street." Another pause. "You live on Elm Street?" Karen asked. "I do," Marcus said. "And I take my role as HOA president very seriously." She ended the call and handed the phone back to Tyler. Tyler took it like it was made of something dangerous. He looked at his phone, then at Marcus, and for a moment, they were just 2 people standing at the edge of a pool that shouldn't have existed in its current state, separated by authority and age and the simple fact that Marcus had just demonstrated what happened when you didn't follow the rules. "Your mother's going to handle this," Marcus said. "But I suggest you stop using the pool until she does. And tell your friends that pool parties on Elm Street are cancelled until further notice." She walked back through the gate, latched it carefully behind her, and didn't look back until she reached the street. Behind her, Tyler was texting someone, probably his friends, probably a version of events that made Marcus into a villain. She didn't care. She'd just done her job. She'd enforced the rules. She'd reminded the Valencia estates that there was a new authority in town, and that authority took her position seriously. She had no way of knowing that she'd just planted a seed that was going to bloom into something far more complicated than a simple violation issue. Karen didn't email her plan by Monday. She didn't email it by Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday either. By Friday, Marcus had filed an escalated violation, adding a $300 fine to the property record and making the violation matter official in the Valencia Estates database, which meant it would now show up on any future property records, affecting Karen's home value and her ability to refinance or sell. Karen called on Saturday morning, voice tight with controlled anger. "I have a plan," she said without preamble. "My contractor got back to me. He can do the pool draining and algae remediation on July 20th. That's 5 days within your deadline." "I'll need that in writing," Marcus said, matching Karen's tone exactly. They were past the point of pleasantries. "I'm emailing it to you right now," Karen said, and then she hung up. The email arrived 40 seconds later, along with a screenshot of the contractor's quote. The plan was legitimate, the timeline was acceptable, and technically, Karen had complied with Marcus's requirements. Marcus should have marked the violation as in progress and moved on to the next property on her list. Instead, she found herself thinking about the pool. She'd driven by 447 Elm Street 3 times since the incident with Tyler. Each time, the pool had been empty of teenagers, but each time, it had still been there, a stagnant monument to negligence, to the kind of casual disregard for community standards that had probably infected the entire neighborhood under Gerald's watch. It was irrational to be bothered by it. It was even more irrational to find herself standing at the fence line on Sunday evening, looking at the pool, trying to understand what was driving Karen's behavior. Because Karen wasn't stupid. Karen clearly understood the rules. Karen worked in an office somewhere and understood professional hierarchies and deadlines. So why had it taken Marcus's direct intervention for her to actually do something about it? "You're judging me." Marcus turned to find a woman standing on the other side of the fence, early 50s, blonde hair with expensive-looking highlights, wearing yoga pants and a look of extreme irritation. This had to be Karen. "I'm looking at my neighborhood," Marcus said carefully. "Making sure the standards we all agreed to are being maintained." Karen opened the gate, the same gate that had been left open that day with Tyler and his friends, and stepped out onto the street. She was shorter than Marcus had expected, a full 4 inches shorter, which gave Marcus an unexpected advantage in their dynamic. "Do you get off on this?" Karen asked. "On making people feel small." "I get off on maintaining community standards," Marcus replied. "Your pool has been a violation for months. I'm simply enforcing the rules that all of us agreed to when we bought into this community." "I didn't agree to live under a fascist," Karen said, her voice rising slightly. "The old president, Gerald, he understood that people have complicated lives. He understood that sometimes you can't fix every little thing the moment someone notices it. Gerald," Marcus said, "left this community in chaos. That's not understanding. That's abdication." Karen's face flushed. She took a step closer, and Marcus could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive that didn't match the intensity of her expression. "Do you know what I do?" Karen asked. "I'm an executive assistant at Wellington Securities. I work 60-hour weeks. I have a teenage son who I'm trying to keep out of trouble. I have a pool that's been broken since February because the contractor who I hired flaked out and the company that built it went out of business. And in the middle of all of this, I got 3 notices about violation codes that nobody in this neighborhood even knew existed before you became president." "People knew," Marcus said. "Gerald just didn't enforce them." "Exactly," Karen said. "People knew, and nobody cared because this was a place where you could just live. You could just exist without someone showing up at your fence line like the pool police. Your son," Marcus said, "was having a pool party in contaminated water. That's not just living. That's negligence." Something shifted in Karen's expression. She took a step back, crossing her arms. "Leave my son out of this," she said. "I'm not making it about your son," Marcus replied. "I'm pointing out that there are actual consequences to ignoring these rules. He was swimming in water that hadn't been treated in months. If something had happened to him or his friends, if someone had gotten sick, you'd be liable." Karen turned away, looking back at her house. When she turned back to face Marcus, her expression had shifted from anger to something more complicated. "My ex-husband left 2 years ago," she said, her voice quieter now. "He was supposed to help with the pool maintenance. He was supposed to help with a lot of things. But instead, he decided that my life wasn't worth being part of anymore, and now I'm alone in a 6-bedroom house trying to keep everything together while my teenage son decides that rules don't apply to him. So I'm sorry if your rules feel less important than just surviving the week." Marcus felt the weight of that statement. She'd read it as a deflection, as Karen trying to make her feel bad for enforcing standards. But there was something else underneath it, genuine exhaustion, the particular kind of defeat that came from being overwhelmed. "I'm not unsympathetic to your situation," Marcus said carefully. "But I can't enforce rules selectively. If I let your violation slide, I have to let everyone slide. And then we're back to the chaos we had before. There's a middle ground, Karen said. Between chaos and fascism. Is there? Marcus asked. What does that look like? Karen didn't have an answer. She just turned and went back through the gate, closing it with a deliberate click that might have been an accusation. Marcus didn't sleep well that night. She found herself thinking about Karen's words, about the idea that she was being fascistic, about whether she was enforcing the rules or just flexing authority because she could. By Tuesday morning, she'd decided that she needed more information. She pulled up the community database and started researching properties. She looked at how many violations had been issued over the past 5 years, how many had been followed up on, how many had been allowed to slide. The pattern that emerged was stark. Under Gerald's watch, violations had been issued but rarely enforced. Out of 47 violations issued in 2023, only 3 had resulted in escalated enforcement and fines. The rest had simply existed in the database, warning shots that nobody actually had to duck for. Marcus had issued 73 violations in her first month. She looked at Karen's property record specifically, 3 violations in the past year, all related to the pool. Before that, nothing for 4 years. Karen had been a clean property owner. The pool situation was new. It was specific. It was the kind of thing that could happen to anyone. She pulled up the names of people who'd been selected for the HOA board before her. She found that Karen had applied twice, in 2019 and 2021. Both times, she'd been passed over. Gerald had selected people who would rubber stamp his agenda, which was essentially, do nothing. Marcus spent the next 3 days compiling data. She created a spreadsheet of violations, of who'd been hit hardest, of whether there was a pattern to her enforcement. What she found was upsetting. She'd been much harder on people in the western section of Valencia estates, which happened to be where more families with children lived. She'd been softer on the retired residents in the northern section. She'd issued no violations at all in the eastern section, where several properties had actual problems. The eastern section was where Gerald lived. It wasn't intentional bias, Marcus knew that the moment she recognized it. But it was bias nonetheless. She'd been enforcing the rules, yes, but she'd been enforcing them with the unconscious weight of her own assumptions about who cared about their homes and who didn't, about who deserved grace and who deserved punishment. Karen's violation wasn't exceptional. Karen's violation was the one that had happened to bump into Marcus when she was trying to make a point about authority. By Friday, Marcus had made a decision that she knew would be unpopular with the residents who'd voted her in on a platform of accountability. She called an emergency HOA board meeting and proposed a new policy, a grace period. 30 days for every violation issued under her administration to be either remediated or responded to with a legitimate plan. Only then would escalated enforcement proceed. The board approved it 5-1, with only Margaret Torres, the senior board member, voting against. Margaret believed in zero tolerance. Margaret had even suggested that Marcus expand the violation search to include properties that had been overlooked under Gerald. Marcus shut that down immediately. The grace period meant that Karen's escalated fine would be removed from the record if she met her July 20 deadline. Marcus sent Karen an email explaining the change in policy, copying the entire board. The pool was fixed by July 18, 2 days before the deadline. Marcus knew this because she'd taken to walking past 447 Elm Street on her morning jogs, and she'd seen the transformation. The water had been drained, cleaned, refilled, and treated until it shone like something from a resort advertisement. The pool equipment had been replaced. The deck had been power washed. Karen had not just met the requirements, she'd exceeded them. Marcus had submitted the violation clearance report to the community database on July 19, marking the issue as resolved and noting the date of remediation. Legally and officially, the violation ceased to exist. She should have felt satisfied. Instead, she felt uneasy. She was standing at the mailbox in her kitchen, sorting through bills and community notices, when she found a handwritten envelope addressed to her. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the kind of writing that someone practices before committing it to something permanent. Inside was a single card. On the front was a generic image of a sunset over water. Inside, Karen had written, "Marcus, I want to apologize for how I spoke to you on Sunday. You were doing your job. I was scared and overwhelmed and I took it out on you. That was wrong. You should know that getting your grace period email meant something to me. It showed me that you weren't just interested in authority, that you actually cared about being fair. The pool is fixed. My contractors are excellent. My son has learned a valuable lesson about consequences. And I've learned something too about not assuming the worst of people who are just trying to do their jobs. I hope we can start fresh. Karen." Marcus read it 3 times. She'd expected something confrontational or passive-aggressive. Instead, she'd gotten grace offered back. She found Karen's phone number in the community database and called her. "Hi," Karen said when she picked up. "I wasn't sure you'd call." "I got your note," Marcus said. "Thank you for sending it." "I meant it," Karen said. "And I want you to know, you made the right call with that grace period. I was thinking about the neighborhood, and you're going to have residents who need that kind of flexibility. People who aren't intentionally violating rules. People who are just stretched thin." "I think I was being too rigid," Marcus admitted. "I was trying to prove something by being harsh." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Can I ask you something?" Karen said. Why was the old president so bad? Marcus had read the transition documents. She knew the official story. Gerald had stepped down for health reasons, though the real reason was that he'd just gotten tired of the job and wanted to retire to his vacation home in Scottsdale. He didn't care, Marcus said. He let things fall apart. Or maybe, Karen suggested carefully, he understood that perfection wasn't possible and that trying to achieve it just made everyone miserable. Is that a criticism? Marcus asked. No, Karen said. It's just an observation. I think you're good at what you do, Marcus. I think you care. I think you're going to be great for this community. But I also think that mercy is part of leadership too. Not mercy that enables chaos. Just, mercy. After they hung up, Marcus found herself thinking about that word. Mercy. She'd spent her entire career believing that enforcement was more important than compassion, that rules mattered more than circumstances. But maybe that had been a false choice. Maybe rules only mattered if people felt like they were being treated fairly. On August 2nd, Marcus received an email from Karen asking if she wanted to have coffee. Marcus almost declined out of a sense that it might be inappropriate, the HOA president meeting with a property owner who'd recently been in violation. But then she realized that was exactly the kind of rigid thinking that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. They met at Riverside Coffee, a small place near the town center that served drinks in ceramic cups and had an actual barista rather than a machine. Karen was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee positioned across from each other. I ordered for you, Karen said. They said it's what most people order. If you hate it, I'll buy you another. Marcus sat down and took a sip. It was a vanilla latte, and it was exactly what she would have ordered. Lucky guess, Marcus said. Not really, Karen replied. I've seen you walking past my house on morning jogs. You always walk past at the same time, you always look very deliberate about where you're going, and you always carry yourself like someone who's very particular about routines. Vanilla latte seemed like the kind of thing a very particular person would order. You've been observing me? Marcus asked, not sure if she should feel amused or alarmed. I live on the same street, Karen said. Hard not to notice. And I wanted to understand you, the person who'd come into my life and suddenly made me feel like I was failing at something I didn't even know I was supposed to be good at. The pool maintenance, Marcus said. The pool maintenance, Karen agreed. But also everything else. Tyler said something to me the other day that stuck with me. He said, "Mom, that lady makes me want to be better." I asked him why, and he said because it was clear that she believed in standards. She wasn't angry. She was just disappointed. Like she knew I could do better and she was willing to wait for me to figure it out. Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. The image of Tyler, who'd been nothing but defiant teenage swagger on the diving board, thinking of her as someone who believed in him was striking. "Your son," Marcus said carefully, "seemed pretty resistant that day at the pool." "He's 16, Karen said. Resistance is his primary mode of operation. But he's also a good kid. He got it. Once you explained the actual consequences, the liability, the danger, he got it. He took that seriously. And he's been different since. More responsible. More aware that his actions affect other people." "That wasn't my intention," Marcus said. "I was just trying to enforce the rules." "I know," Karen replied. "But sometimes the best parenting, and the best leadership, is just enforcing the rules fairly and letting people figure out the rest." They talked for another hour. Marcus learned that Karen had gotten divorced because her ex-husband had decided he wanted to start fresh in Portland, which apparently meant leaving behind his entire previous life, including his obligations to Karen and Tyler. Karen learned that Marcus had moved to Valencia Estate specifically to escape a career that had burned her out, and that she'd taken the HOA position because she thought controlling her environment would make her feel less out of control. "Did it?" Karen asked. "No," Marcus said. "It made me feel like I was in control of everything except the thing I actually wanted to control, my own peace." "So maybe ease up," Karen suggested. "Maybe being HOA president doesn't have to mean being a dictator. And maybe letting people slide doesn't mean being merciful," Marcus countered. "Maybe it means enabling bad behavior." "True," Karen acknowledged. "So find the middle. That's what I'm trying to do with Tyler. Not let him get away with everything, but not expect perfection either. Just reasonable." When they left the coffee shop, Karen hugged Marcus. It was brief, impersonal, the kind of hug that indicated we've moved past antagonism but not quite to actual friendship. Marcus stood on the sidewalk watching Karen drive away, feeling something shift in her approach to the HOA position. Maybe she could do both. Maybe she could enforce the rules and still be merciful. Maybe those things didn't have to be contradictory. She spent the next week thinking about that, about how to be an effective leader without being a tyrant. She created new policies, mandatory grace periods, open communication requirements, escalated enforcement procedures that included multiple opportunities for remediation. She made the HOA guidelines less about punishment and more about partnership. The board approved most of them. Margaret Torres abstained on all votes. On August 15, Marcus received an invitation to a neighborhood barbecue at Karen's house. It was addressed to Marcus Chen and guest. There were 20 families invited. It was clearly not a personal invitation but rather a community gesture. Marcus should have declined. She should have maintained professional distance from people she might have to enforce violations against. Instead, she asked the question that would lead to everything that came after. Marcus brought her sister, Julie, to the barbecue. Julie was a divorce attorney, sharp-tongued and considerably more social than Marcus, and she'd spent the last 3 weeks needling Marcus about being too tense and needing to have actual human experiences outside of enforcing municipal code. The barbecue was the kind of suburban event that Marcus usually avoided, folding tables covered with store-bought desserts, a cooler full of beer on the back patio, children running around with untied shoes while adults pretended to watch them. But Karen had worked hard, Marcus could see that immediately. The food was actually good, the drinks were actually cold, and there was something genuinely welcoming about the way Karen had organized the space. Tyler was there, working the grill with careful attention. He was different from the defiant teenager on the diving board. More focused. More present. He looked up and saw Marcus and raised his tongs in something that might have been a greeting or might have been a test to see if she'd soften. Marcus nodded, and he returned to grilling. "That's the infamous Tyler?" Julie asked, appearing at Marcus's shoulder with a beer she'd somehow already acquired. "That's him," Marcus confirmed. "He seems normal," Julie observed. "Not like a teenager who makes his mother's life difficult." "He's 16, Marcus said. Normal and difficult are the same thing at that age." They mingled. Julie charmed several of the husbands and scandalized a few of the wives by mentioning her divorce law practice. Marcus found herself standing with several people she'd issued violations to, and the conversations were surprisingly civil. One man thanked her for the grace period policy. Another woman mentioned that she'd started a neighborhood Facebook group for home maintenance tips. The violations had created something unexpected, accountability that led to community. People didn't like being told what to do, but when they understood that the rules applied equally, when they felt like they were part of the enforcement process rather than its subjects, they actually complied. Around 7 o'clock, Karen found Marcus sitting on a lounge chair, watching the sun start its descent toward the horizon. "You came," Karen said, sitting down next to her. "I almost didn't," Marcus admitted. "It felt like a professional line I shouldn't cross." "Professional lines between neighbors are pretentious," Karen said. "We're going to live next to each other for years. We might as well be civil." "We're past civil," Marcus said. "I think we're actually becoming friends." Karen smiled. It was the first time Marcus had seen her genuinely happy, not forced, not performative, but actually, unreservedly happy. "Good," Karen said. "I could use a friend. Someone who understands that life is complicated and messy and that sometimes the right thing to do is let people make mistakes." "But not Tyler," Marcus said. "With Tyler, you should probably enforce the rules." "Noted," Karen replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the neighborhood settle into evening. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor was setting up a fire pit. Someone else had started a playlist that drifted softly across the yards. It was Marcus's sister who started it. She was the one who brought it up, the one who asked the question that would have been better left unasked. Julie had been talking to Margaret Torres, the board member who'd voted against Marcus's grace period policies. Margaret, it turned out, had several complaints about various neighborhood properties and had been trying to get Julie's business card because she was thinking about running for HOA president in the next election. When Julie mentioned this to Marcus, as a joke, Marcus felt something crystallize. The realization that not everyone was happy with her approach, that there were people in the community who wanted exactly what she was moving away from, strict, unforgiving enforcement. And Margaret Torres lived in the eastern section, where Marcus had issued no violations. The thought planted itself like a seed: what if Margaret had been warned away? What if the reason Marcus had issued no violations in the eastern section was because she'd unconsciously treated properties differently based on who lived there? Marcus pulled the database up that night and started looking at the eastern section more carefully. What she found made her sick. There were properties on Oakwood Drive and Eastern Boulevard with visible violations. Lawns that needed maintenance, roofs that needed attention, pool equipment that was aging. But Marcus had never issued a single violation. Not because the rules didn't apply. But because, and she had to be honest with herself about this, she'd been unconsciously giving certain people passes. She looked at who lived in the eastern section, retirees, mostly. Older people, fixed incomes, people who reminded her of her mother. She'd given them mercy. She'd given younger families with children in the western section discipline. The double standard was stark. It was also unconscious. She hadn't meant to do it. But that didn't make it less real. At 2 a.m, sitting in her kitchen, Marcus made a decision that she knew would cost her the support of at least half the community. She was going to issue violations to the eastern section properties. She was going to be consistent, fair, and blind to circumstances. It was the right thing to do. But it was also going to be catastrophic. She scheduled the violations to be issued on Tuesday morning. That gave her a few days to prepare the documentation, to make sure everything was absolutely bulletproof, to steel herself for the backlash. The violations hit the eastern section like a summer storm, sudden, comprehensive, and deeply unpopular. 16 properties received notices on Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Margaret Torres had called an emergency meeting of the board, and by Tuesday evening, there were 73 angry emails in Marcus's inbox. It was Gerald who called her on Wednesday morning. Marcus hadn't expected to ever hear from Gerald. He lived in Scottsdale now, supposedly retired, supposedly out of the picture. But there he was, his voice on the phone, measured and controlled and dangerous. "I've been hearing some things about the new HOA president," he said without preamble. "Seems like you're making waves." "I'm enforcing the community standards that I was elected to enforce," Marcus said, keeping her voice professional. "You're picking favorites," Gerald countered. "You've issued 0 violations on the western section over the past month, despite at least 4 properties with legitimate issues. You've been soft on families with children, hard on young professionals. And now you're suddenly going after the senior properties with what looks like an intentional bias." "I'm correcting an oversight," Marcus said. "I should never have issued violations selectively." "Of course you issue selectively," Gerald said, and there was something almost tired in his voice, like he was teaching a lesson he'd already taught 100 times. "Any reasonable person does. You can't enforce every rule on every person all the time. That's not leadership. That's tyranny. Leadership is knowing which battles are worth fighting and which ones will just destroy the community you're trying to protect." "That's not leadership," Marcus said. "That's corruption." "No," Gerald said quietly. "Corruption is when you take bribes. Selective enforcement is when you understand that a community is people, not rules. When you understand that Karen's pool being a little grimy for 6 months isn't worth destroying a friendship or damaging her relationship with her son." "I never," Marcus started, but Gerald cut her off. "You held the threat over her," he said. "Don't pretend you didn't. You made an example out of her to show everyone else that you were serious. And now you're doing the same thing to the elderly residents because you realized you had a blind spot. Except now you're doing it deliberately, which actually is worse." "They violated the rules," Marcus said. "So did everyone," Gerald replied. "The difference is whether you help them fix it or use it as a club." After Gerald hung up, Marcus sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. She wanted to dismiss him as someone who'd failed at his job and was now criticizing the person who was trying to clean up his mess. But what he'd said was accurate. She had been using violations selectively, based on unconscious biases. And now she was overcorrecting in a way that was still selective, just pointed in a different direction. She wanted to call Karen, but she was afraid of what Karen would say. Karen had helped her understand mercy. Karen had shown her that leadership could include grace. And what had Marcus done? She'd taken that lesson and compartmentalized it, applying it to people she liked and withholding it from people she hadn't thought about. The board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening. By noon, there were 2 formal challenges filed against Marcus's HOA presidency, one by Margaret Torres, requesting an emergency election, and another by a coalition of 17 residents from the eastern section, demanding that all recent violations be rescinded. Marcus prepared her defense. She printed out spreadsheets showing her violation records, showing the inconsistencies in her enforcement, showing exactly what she'd done and why. She was going to stand in front of the board and admit the mistake and propose a new system, one where all violations would be issued fairly and consistently, with clear criteria for enforcement and escalation. It was the professional thing to do. It was the right thing to do. But she was terrified because she knew it was also going to tank her credibility as HOA president. Karen called her at 3 p.m. "I heard about the eastern section violations," Karen said without preamble. "I'm correcting a mistake," Marcus replied. "You're being inconsistent," Karen said, and there was something sharp in her voice that Marcus hadn't heard before. You took what I taught you about mercy and you're using it as a club against older people who can't afford big fines. At least have the integrity to admit that's what you're doing. I'm not using it against anyone, Marcus said. I'm trying to be fair. No, Karen said, you're trying to be certain. You're trying to remove all the messiness, all the uncertainty, all the parts of community leadership that require actual judgment. And in doing that, you're being unfair to people who actually need the mercy you just decided to take away from them. Should I just not enforce anything? Marcus asked, frustrated. Should I just let the community fall apart like it did before? There's a middle ground, Karen said, and Marcus recognized her own words being thrown back at her, the phrase she'd been searching for weeks ago when Karen had suggested it to her. You find the middle ground. Marcus attended the board meeting that evening knowing that her presidency was probably over. She walked into the community center and found the room packed, not just board members but residents, dozens of them, here to watch the spectacle. Margaret Torres moved immediately for an emergency election. The formal challenges were read aloud. Residents from the eastern section stood up and talked about their properties, their circumstances, their shock at receiving violations from a president who'd been praised for her mercy just weeks before. And then Karen stood up. I want to say something, she said, and her voice carried weight. People turned to listen. 2 months ago, Marcus issued me a violation for my pool. It was a fair violation. My pool was dirty, my son was using contaminated water, and I had ignored 3 notices. She was right to enforce it. But she also showed me something important, that enforcement can come from a place of caring about the community rather than just punishing people. She gave me a grace period because she understood that my situation had complexity. She believed in standards but also in mercy. Karen paused, looking directly at Marcus. What she just did to the eastern section violated that principle, Karen continued. She's right that she was inconsistent before. She's right that she gave senior residents a pass when she should have followed her own rules. But the answer to that mistake isn't to suddenly become harsh with them. The answer is to find the middle ground. To acknowledge that enforcement matters but that how you enforce it matters too. Karen sat down, and for a moment, nobody moved. It was the older residents' turn then. They talked about their properties, their circumstances, their own complexity. A woman named Patricia Martinez talked about her roof, which did need work, and which she'd been planning to fix all summer, and which she would fix even without a violation notice because she cared about her home. A man named Richard Thompson talked about aging in place, about trying to maintain a home while your body was failing you, about the difference between malice and overwhelm. And gradually, the tone of the meeting shifted. By the time votes were called, Margaret's motion for an emergency election had been rejected. Instead, the board voted unanimously, with Margaret abstaining, to give Marcus a formal warning and require her to attend mediation training before implementing any new enforcement policies. It should have felt like a defeat, but as Marcus stood in that room looking at people who decided to give her a second chance at getting this right, it felt like something else. 6 months later, Marcus stood in her kitchen looking out at the Valencia Estates community and it was different now. Not perfect, that had never been the goal, but better. More thoughtful. More human. She'd implemented a new enforcement policy with clear, published guidelines. Violations were still issued, but with a mandatory communication step where she talked directly with property owners about their circumstances before escalating. Grace periods were still available, but they were applied consistently and fairly across all sections of the community. She'd hired a community liaison to help residents who were struggling with repairs understand their options and available resources. The result was unexpected, more violations were actually being remediated, not fewer. People responded better when they felt respected than when they felt punished. Karen had been elected to the board in a special election and was now the vice president. They'd become actual friends, the kind who texted about things that had nothing to do with HOA violations. Tyler had turned into a surprisingly responsible young man who'd even volunteered to help Richard Thompson with some repairs on his roof. It was almost domestic, in its way. A community finding its balance. Marcus was standing at her mailbox on a Saturday morning in late January when she found another handwritten envelope. This one was from Patricia Martinez. Inside was a photo, Patricia's house after her roof had been replaced. It looked good. It looked cared for. And underneath the photo, Patricia had written, "Thank you for believing that I could do better." P. Marcus stood there reading that note and realized that this was what Gerald had been talking about. This was leadership, not the perfect enforcement of rules, but the understanding that the point of rules wasn't to punish people. The point was to create space where people could take care of themselves and each other. She heard a honk from the street and looked up to find Karen pulling into her driveway. "We're having an emergency meeting," Karen called out as she got out of the car. "Margaret is trying to start a petition to remove you for being too lenient with the southern section." Marcus laughed. Of course Margaret was. "Let her," Marcus said. "We're following the policies. We're being fair. If that's not enough for her, then she should run for president herself." "She's thinking about it," Karen replied, walking up to the mailbox. They stood together looking at the community, at the houses with their careful lawns, their maintained roofs, their visible signs of care. Not perfect. Not flawless. But genuinely, honestly trying. "You did good," Karen said. "I know it doesn't feel like it, but you did. You understood that leadership isn't about control. It's about inspiration."